Hola, profesores. Davido Profe here, and today we're going to talk about ideal class lengths and schedules. So let's talk about timing, pacing, and what works best for both you and your students. So I recommend that you plan on meeting with private lessons for about an hour. So that typically works if you have one or two students in a class, and if you have small groups with say 3 to 8 students, the lessons will take a little bit longer. So plan for about 90 minutes per lesson there. Each lesson is designed to work within these time frames when students are prepared and do the work. When you're first getting started, and especially for new students that are beginners, I recommend starting with meeting with them just once a week so that they will have time to study, review vocabulary, and complete homework. Sometimes students will want more, but I think about it like this. Your students are really busy. They've got work, family, and life can slow down the learning process. So that's why I recommend, especially for true beginners, only meeting for about once a week. This allows them to make steady progress with better retention, and it gives them time to complete all the work that they should be doing between the classes. Now, if you have more motivated students, so for students that are showing up consistently, that are completing their homework, and they're really committed to the learning process, then you can definitely offer them extra classes per week or even longer sessions. So trying to do 2 sessions or 2 lessons at a time instead of just 1 hour, but adding an additional hour can also work in that situation. Now, the reason why our lessons are set up this way, it's basically, it has to do with the way that your brain works. So think about the 20-minute learning rule. The brain processes and retains information best in 20-minute chunks, especially when followed by active engagement or a shift in focus. This isn't just theory. Studies by neuroscientists like John Medina, who's the author of this book you can see here on the right, The Brain Rules, they can confirm all this stuff. So the brain loves these 20-minute learning chunks. We've used the science to structure our classes so that we teach, practice, and then move on to a new topic in anywhere from 5 to 20-minute chunks. This keeps the students alert, active, and engaged, and improves long-term retention. It's actually common for students to finish an hour or an hour and a half class and be walking out like, wait, I thought we just started, because they're so actively engaged and the classes are dynamic. So we're still abiding by this 20-minute learning rule, even though the classes are longer than that. But that's also why you don't want to really do, I see some programs that do classes for like 2 or 3 hours at a time, that it can also create brain overload. And at a certain point, the brain just gets saturated and stops retaining the information. All right. So ideally, classes are going to take 60 to 90 minutes long, depending on the group size. However, there are a variety of factors that can cause classes to go slower or to go faster. So let's first start off by talking about what slows classes down. Well, students that don't do the practice and the homework that you're giving them, students who miss class, and then oftentimes with this demographic, you're going to have students that have less of an educational foundation in the first place. So I'm thinking about students that have not made it past the 3rd grade. They haven't studied in a really long time, so they don't exactly know what that means to study. And then it's curious to think about this, but living here in the United States, a lot of these students don't actually have much exposure to the English language. So, theoretically coming to class, learning, and then they're going outside and in the community and they're being forced to use the language like what I did when I lived in Argentina. That doesn't happen with these students. They leave class and they go back home to their Spanish-speaking family, and they go to work with their Spanish-speaking co-workers, and it's odd to think about it, but they don't actually have a lot of exposure to the English language. Now, the last one is actually something that can be a good thing, is if you have somebody with a really talkative personality and somebody that asks a whole lot of questions. You have to manage that dynamic because you still have to push the classes forward. You have to know when to answer questions and when to, punt, when to essentially say, hey, I'll answer that question in a future class. So that's something you'll get good at and learn over time. So you'll learn to better pace your classes and adapt with experience, but think about that, hour to 90-minute time frame when you're going into these classes. So, some good advice for new teachers is to start with hour-long private lessons until you feel confident, until you learn to pace your lessons, and until you understand what your students need. Once you're ready, then I definitely recommend moving to small groups. Depending on your experience level, your confidence, this can take a week, this can take 3 months. But it's all really up to you and your own personal confidence. Now, another thing that can slow down the classes is if you go off script. I've seen this happen a million times where a teacher is going through the slides. There's something that they feel like is incomplete about the slide, so they start over explaining the topic, or they start doing activities based off of what they see, and they're just kind of freestyling it, and then they go to the next slide, and the very next slide has a much better explanation than what they were just making up. So stick to the script, stick to the slides, trust the flow of this program. Repetition and explanations have been built into this. And that's why I also recommend, before you give your first lesson, to go through the PowerPoint presentations so that you know what's coming next. And then you'll be less likely to go off script. Now, what happens if you finish a lesson early? Well, if there's still time left in class, just move on to the next lesson. Sometimes you go through the slides a little bit faster if you have classes that are less talkative. So every class is a little bit different. Don't just start making stuff up in this situation, right? Just open up the next presentation. If you're on lesson one and you still have 15 minutes left in class, then close lesson one and open up lesson two. Likewise, let's say you don't get through a full lesson. Maybe you're on slide 50 out of a 60 slide presentation, but the time's up. Well, make a note of it in your student notes, and then that way you know where to pick up next time. So I do have a playlist on my YouTube channel where you can see me teaching the classes. So you can see how I pace the classes. You can see how I explain things in the classes, and how I manage students. So definitely watch my YouTube recordings and my YouTube playlist as much as you'd like so that you can learn tone, timing, and how to keep class on track. That is it for today's little lesson. Have fun with it. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next training video. Ciao, ciao.